Hi everyone, my name is Dark Secrets Chronicles, and today we're going to delve into another harrowing case. Monday, September 14th, 2015, was a day that 16-year-old Nolan Buchanan would remember as the best day of his life. The previous day, he had enjoyed Sunday with his girlfriend, attended morning mass with her family, spent time with friends, and ended with a romantic evening. Waking up that Monday next to his favorite girl, he felt like a successful, influential young man with the world at his feet. Nolan had recently inherited Buchanan Construction, making him the owner of a company, properties, and assets. He had big plans to manage the family business independently, aiming to outperform his father, who had struggled with financial issues in the company. But on October 1st, 2015, just a few weeks after this idyllic day, Nolan was arrested at Bonita High School in Bonita, California, by the El Dorado County Sheriff's Office. He was held at the Juvenile Treatment Center, JTC, in South Lake Tahoe until June 13, 2018, when an El Dorado County jury found him guilty of 3 charges. The jury deliberated for only 2 hours before sentencing him to 150 years in prison, with the possibility of parole after 25 years. This marked the tragic end of his plans for the family business. Neighbors and classmates had only good things to say about Nolan, describing him as a model student and a kind young man. "As far as I know, he was a good kid," said a fellow student, Campbell Ruan, in an interview. "He always cared about school, seemed very kind, and was very nice. I'm even surprised he was arrested." But what really happened in the Buchanan family? Let's examine this tragic case in detail. Molly first met Adam Buchanan when she applied for a job at his construction firm as an office manager. At the time, Adam was already divorced and raising his son, Nolan, from a previous marriage. Molly, with her cheerful personality and bright demeanor, quickly captured Adam's interest, and their mutual attraction blossomed into a serious relationship. Soon, Molly moved in with Adam, and not long after became pregnant. Their son, Gavin, was born, and by all accounts, the Buchanans appeared to be a close-knit family. The head of the family, Adam, earned enough from his construction company to support a comfortable lifestyle, and they even purchased a small cabin on 19 acres in Greenwood, El Dorado County, California. The rustic cabin without electricity, water, sewer, or gas was a pet project for Adam, who took on the remodeling work himself. The family enjoyed frequent visits to the property. On September 13, 2015, at around 10 a.m., the Garden Valley Fire Department responded to a wildfire in Greenwood Township, El Dorado County. They found that the fire had destroyed 10 acres, and the Buchanan's cabin was reduced to ashes, still smoldering when firefighters arrived. Among the ashes, charred remains were discovered, initially thought to be a pet trapped inside. However, further examination revealed a human skull and other remains, signaling a much darker discovery. With the identification of a Dodge truck and trailer on the property, registered to Buchanan Construction, the El Dorado County Sheriff's Office initiated an investigation. It didn't take long to trace the truck back to Adam Buchanan, the company owner, who lived 3 hours away in Bonita, California. To determine who was inside the cabin during the fire, detectives began with the Buchanan household in Bonita. Upon arrival, they encountered Nolan, who explained that his father, stepmother Molly, and younger brother Gavin had gone to the cabin for the weekend and were expected back that evening. The remains found in the cabin raised suspicions. By the evening of September 13th, it became clear that 2 people were deceased, and the family was reported missing. When the fire scene cooled on September 15th, investigators discovered additional remains, including a skull with a bullet hole. This pointed to homicide, and the initial theory of an accidental fire was dismissed. Investigators began examining the Buchanans' lives for clues. They discovered that Molly and Adam's relationship had been deteriorating, with Molly even documenting instances of abuse in a diary. Witnesses described Adam as rude and controlling, not only towards Molly but also the children. Despite their tumultuous relationship, Molly stayed with Adam, although she would occasionally leave with Gavin to her parents' home after heated arguments. Given the family's history and the presence of firearms at the cabin, investigators theorized that a confrontation might have led to violence. However, no weapon was found in the remains, ruling out a murder-suicide scenario. The search for a weapon continued, and after several days of combing through the site, investigators found no trace of firearms. By September 18th, detectives had shifted their focus back to Buchanan Construction, where they learned that the company was nearing bankruptcy. Former employees expressed resentment over recent layoffs, adding a new angle to the investigation. Then, on September 19th, a discovery was made. A purse with Molly's ID and a .22 caliber rifle were found hidden near the construction company. This suggested a targeted attack, with the murderer disposing of evidence near Adam's workplace. Reviewing security footage from the firm revealed a crucial clue. On the day of the fire, Adam had driven a Ford F-150, not a Dodge truck as Nolan claimed. This contradiction, along with surveillance footage of the Ford traveling between Bonita and the cabin, led investigators to re-examine Nolan's alibi. Upon further questioning, Nolan admitted to using his father's credit card during the weekend, contradicting his earlier statements. Forensic analysis confirmed that Nolan's fingerprints were on the rifle, and on July 13, 2018, he was found guilty of 3 counts of first-degree murder. During sentencing, Judge Kingsbury reflected on Nolan's claims of abuse, noting that he may have felt that killing his family was the only escape from his father's control. However, the judge cited evidence of premeditation, arson, and attempts to fabricate an alibi as proof of Nolan's guilt. Sentenced to 150 years, with the possibility of parole in 25 years, Nolan maintains his innocence. Analyzing Nolan's motive, in-depth assessment of pressures and influences. Let's delve deeper into the pressures and influences that may have motivated Nolan to commit such an unthinkable act, specifically examining his financial strain, fractured family relationships, and his perceived role within the family and the company. 1. Financial strain and the weight of inheritance. Inherited financial struggles. Nolan found himself inheriting Buchanan Construction, a business on the brink of collapse. This would be a heavy burden for anyone, let alone a teenager. The company's severe financial instability, mounting debt, and threat of bankruptcy likely created an intense sense of responsibility in Nolan. He might have felt an expectation to salvage what his father had built, but lacking experience, he likely saw this responsibility as both a privilege and a trap. Perceived ineptitude of his father. Watching his father struggle to manage the business could have stirred a mix of resentment and frustration. He might have thought that his father's poor decisions directly impacted his inheritance, eroding his future security and status. In Nolan's mind, he might have envisioned a much more successful legacy for himself if he could take full control. His father's leadership may have appeared not only ineffective but actively harmful, creating a buildup of anger towards his father as a barrier to success. Economic anxiety and desperation. Financial worries, especially in a family-centered business, can create severe mental strain. For Nolan, the fear of losing everything might have fueled an underlying desperation, making him feel cornered. This anxiety might have led him to believe that removing his father or any competing family interest was the only way to secure his financial future and restore the business. 2. Fractured family relationships and emotional tensions. Strained father-son relationship. Nolan's relationship with his father, Adam, appears to have been particularly strained. Whether due to generational conflicts, personality clashes, or Adam's alleged abusive behavior, Nolan may have harbored a deep-seated resentment. His father might have represented not only a financial burden but also an emotional adversary, standing in the way of his independence and vision for the family legacy. This difficult relationship could have intensified the notion that his father's removal was necessary for Nolan to assume control of both the business and his life. Influence of family dynamics on Nolan's mental state. Living in a potentially abusive environment can erode one's mental well-being, leading to feelings of entrapment and hostility. If Nolan felt that he, his stepmother, and his younger brother were victims of his father's controlling or abusive behavior, his resentment could have grown to extreme levels. In such situations, family members may feel justified in drastic actions to escape or liberate themselves from a toxic situation. Nolan might have begun to see his family as a barrier to personal freedom and peace, especially if he believed he could provide a better, safer life for himself and his brother without his father's influence. Emotional isolation and lack of support. Adolescents dealing with significant family tension and abuse often experience emotional isolation, as they feel they have no one to turn to. Without a strong support system, Nolan may have internalized his frustration and anger, This lack of emotional outlet could have fueled his desire for revenge or drastic action as a way to release his pent-up resentment, feeling that no one outside his immediate family could understand the depth of his suffering. 3. Nolan's perception of his role within the family and the company. Feeling of entrapment and insecurity. Inheriting the family business might have initially felt like a chance for independence, but with his father's continued involvement, Nolan could have perceived his role as restricted and trapped. He likely viewed himself as the rightful leader of the company, but felt constrained by his father's presence, which prevented him from enacting his own vision. This feeling of entrapment could have magnified his frustration, pushing him to see extreme measures as the only way to achieve autonomy. Desire to prove his maturity and capability. Being a young inheritor of a struggling business, Nolan may have felt the need to prove himself as capable, mature, and successful, especially if he sensed doubt from his father or others around him. This desire for validation might have pushed him to consider drastic actions to assert his authority. By eliminating his father, Nolan may have believed he would no longer need to compete for control, thus finally establishing himself as a self-sufficient adult. Overwhelmed by responsibility, the weight of the family business coupled with his youth could have left Nolan feeling overwhelmed and ill-prepared. While the idea of owning the business might have been appealing, the reality of handling finances, management, and responsibilities likely exceeded his capabilities. This disparity between desire and reality could have created a psychological crisis. Rather than facing the challenges with patience and guidance, Nolan's lack of maturity might have led him to see his father as the problem, pushing him toward a dangerous sense of entitlement to control. Combined influences leading to a final act. Together, these layers of financial strain, family discord, and Nolan's perceived role create a powerful and volatile cocktail of motivations. Nolan's view of his father as both a financial and emotional obstacle likely compounded his frustration, resentment, and desperation, painting his father as an enemy rather than a figure of authority or support. In his mind, eliminating his father and assuming control of the business might have seemed like the only way to escape from both personal and financial confinement. In summary, Nolan's motives appear rooted in a mix of psychological, financial, and relational factors that led him to feel trapped, desperate, and justified in taking extreme action. The blurred boundaries between family dynamics and business interests might have convinced him that this drastic step was a solution to the entanglement of pressures he faced. This combination of influences may have ultimately driven him toward an irreversible decision to remove what he perceived as insurmountable obstacles in his life. The police investigation process, step-by-step analysis of how law enforcement uncovered the truth. The investigation into the Buchanan family tragedy required meticulous police work, combining forensic analysis, evidence gathering, witness interrogation, and careful surveillance. Let's examine each phase in detail to understand how law enforcement pieced together the truth behind the murders. 1. Initial scene analysis and evidence collection at the burned cabin. Firefighters' discovery and police involvement. The Garden Valley Fire Department initially responded to a wildfire on the Buchanan family's property, where they found the cabin reduced to ashes. While the firefighters initially believed the remains were those of an animal, they soon discovered human remains. Recognizing the possibility of foul play, they called in the El Dorado County Sheriff's Office, which marked the beginning of the criminal investigation. Assessment of the burned remains. Police and forensic teams arrived to examine the site, which still smoldered from the fire. Working carefully amidst the debris, they uncovered partial remains that included a human skull and parts of a burned torso. The severity of the fire complicated their ability to identify the remains immediately. This careful assessment aimed to determine if the deaths resulted from the fire itself or if foul play was involved, which would direct the trajectory of the investigation. Physical evidence at the scene. Forensic examiners collected what remained in the charred wreckage, focusing on any distinguishable physical evidence that could identify the deceased or the cause of death. Among the critical finds were fragments of bone and a skull with a bullet hole, which confirmed that a homicide had occurred. This finding shifted the investigation's direction from an accidental fire to a deliberate act of murder and arson. 2. Identification of the victims and cause of death. Forensic DNA testing. The next step was sending the remains to the forensic lab for DNA testing to confirm their identities. DNA tests conclusively identified the bodies as those of Adam Buchanan, his wife Molly, and their 8-year-old son Gavin. This crucial discovery established that the Buchanan family had not died in the fire by accident. They were the victims of a premeditated act. Bullet wound analysis and determination of cause of death. Forensic experts observed gunshot wounds in the remains, including a bullet lodged in the thigh of one of the victims and a bullet hole in Gavin's skull. Ballistic analysis of the wounds showed that the angles were inconsistent with suicide, ruling out the possibility of a murder-suicide and pointing instead to a third party involved in the killings. The presence of multiple gunshot wounds suggested that each family member was intentionally targeted, reinforcing the homicide angle. Determining fire as a cover-up, investigators concluded that the fire was likely set to destroy evidence, as no other logical explanation for the blaze was apparent. Gasoline traces on the remains and around the cabin further supported the theory that the fire was a deliberate attempt to cover up the murders. 3. Investigation of vehicle and surveillance evidence. Discovery of the Buchanan family vehicle. Near the cabin, police found a Dodge truck registered to Buchanan Construction. This vehicle became a crucial piece of evidence as detectives tracked its recent usage. Detectives checked the vehicle's license plates, confirming that it belonged to the family business and was used to transport supplies and materials. Surveillance and inconsistencies. Surveillance footage from Buchanan Construction revealed discrepancies in Nolan's account. He initially told police that his father drove a different vehicle to the cabin, but security footage showed Adam using a Ford F-150 instead. By catching these inconsistencies in Nolan's statements, detectives began to suspect he was hiding critical information. Surveillance footage also revealed that the truck made multiple trips to the cabin, showing it was not abandoned but actively used in the crime. Tracking Nolan's activities via surveillance and receipts. Nolan's use of his father's credit card raised suspicion. Detectives tracked his spending, noting purchases made at Taco Bell and other locations. By comparing transaction dates with surveillance footage from these establishments, police identified inconsistencies in Nolan's story about his whereabouts on the night of the fire. This meticulous tracking of his spending and movements helped establish that Nolan was at the scene during the critical time frame. 4. Fingerprint analysis and forensic examination of the firearm. Finding and examining the weapon. As the investigation progressed, a .22 caliber rifle was discovered near Buchanan Construction, hidden under bushes close to the business premises. Detectives immediately sent the rifle for forensic examination. Ballistic testing linked the weapon to the bullet wounds in the victims, establishing it as the murder weapon. Fingerprint evidence. Nolan's fingerprints were found on the rifle, linking him directly to the murders. The presence of his fingerprints on the murder weapon became critical evidence, directly contradicting his story. The forensic team also examined other surfaces in and around the burned cabin to check for additional fingerprints or DNA that might further implicate him. Confirming the sequence of events by piecing together ballistic evidence, fingerprint data, and forensic analysis, investigators reconstructed the sequence of the murders. They determined that Gavin was shot first, followed by his parents, which aligned with the physical evidence and the forensic profiles of each bullet wound. 5. Interrogation and final arrest. Re-examining Nolan's statements, detectives confronted Nolan with the inconsistencies between his initial account and the physical evidence. With each piece of contradicting information, such as the vehicle discrepancies, credit card transactions, and his fingerprints on the weapon, Nolan's story unraveled. When questioned about his whereabouts and spending, his explanations proved inadequate, further casting doubt on his innocence. Psychological tactics and interrogation. During Nolan's interrogation, detectives employed psychological strategies to observe his reactions to specific pieces of evidence, such as his fingerprints on the rifle and his presence near the cabin. By presenting these facts strategically, they aimed to gauge any potential admissions or signs of guilt, which ultimately contributed to his breakdown under questioning. Arrest and final charges. With overwhelming evidence, fingerprints, surveillance footage, forensic ballistics, and witness testimony, police charged Nolan with the murders of his father, stepmother, and younger brother. He was taken into custody, and the forensic evidence presented in court was instrumental in securing his conviction for 3 counts of first-degree murder. Summary of key findings. The investigation combined several layers of forensic and physical evidence, including Fire scene analysis proving that the fire was intentional and intended to destroy evidence. DNA and ballistics confirming the identities of the victims and connecting the murder weapon to Nolan.
Surveillance evidence and financial tracking, uncovering discrepancies in Nolan's alibi, his presence at the scene, and his use of his father's credit card.
Fingerprint analysis, directly linking Nolan to the murder weapon, establishing physical proof of his involvement. Through a meticulous combination of forensic science, surveillance, and psychological interrogation, police were able to piece together a detailed account of the Buchanan family murders, securing a conviction based on hard evidence. This methodical process was essential to revealing the horrific truth behind the case, providing justice for the victims, and exposing the full extent of Nolan's role in the tragedy. Witnesses and family around Nolan, in-depth analysis of reactions and insights into his character and behavior. The reactions and insights from those around Nolan, family, friends, neighbors, and classmates offer a more nuanced understanding of his personality and behavior leading up to the crime. Observing his social interactions and analyzing the testimonies of those who knew him help paint a clearer picture of his character, possible underlying issues, and the tensions within the Buchanan household. 1. Friends and classmates' perspectives on Nolan. Public image vs. Private behavior. Many of Nolan's classmates and friends described him as a model student and a generally well-mannered, respectful young man. His public image was one of politeness, academic diligence, and social kindness, which contrasted sharply with his actions. These friends often expressed disbelief that Nolan could be involved in such a crime, suggesting he had carefully managed his outward persona, hiding any negative emotions or family issues. Possible signs of stress or isolation. While Nolan's friends and peers viewed him positively, there may have been subtle signs of stress, frustration, or even isolation. Some witnesses later recalled instances where Nolan seemed withdrawn or preoccupied, potentially reflecting the emotional burden he carried from his family situation. However, because these signs were subtle, many people around him missed them or attributed his behavior to typical teenage moodiness. Concealment of family tensions. Nolan's reluctance to open up about his home life suggests he wanted to keep family issues private, possibly out of embarrassment, shame, or a desire to protect his image. This concealment could indicate a growing internalization of his emotions, which may have contributed to the eventual outburst of violence. The lack of visible support from friends also suggests Nolan may not have felt he could rely on anyone outside the family, isolating him emotionally. 2. Teachers and school staff observations. Behavioral patterns in school. Teachers and school staff observed Nolan as a disciplined student, one who followed rules and performed well academically. He was reportedly polite in interactions with authority figures, which may have helped him avoid suspicion when his character was questioned. This disciplined exterior could suggest a level of self-control, but it also points to potential repression of deeper emotions that he was not addressing. Possible pressure to succeed. Nolan's teachers may have noticed a sense of pressure or ambition in him, particularly if he viewed academic success as a way to achieve independence or escape his family situation. Some teachers might recall him showing signs of perfectionism or stress, indicating he was managing expectations not just academically but also within his family. This pressure to succeed and maintain control could have masked growing resentment toward his family, especially his father. 3. Neighbors and community members. Perception of the Buchanan family's reputation. Neighbors viewed the Buchanan family as relatively affluent, with Adam Buchanan running a well-known local business. This external image of stability and success, however, masked underlying familial tensions. Neighbors may have seen occasional glimpses of conflict but might have dismissed it as common family disagreements, unaware of the severity. The Buchanans' attempts to maintain appearances likely limited what outsiders could observe, allowing Nolan's issues to remain hidden. Observations of Nolan's family dynamics. Some neighbors later reported witnessing occasional arguments between Adam and Molly, and in a few cases they might have noticed moments of tension between Adam and Nolan. These moments, although rare, could have hinted at a more troubled family life than the family's public image suggested. If neighbors perceived Adam as controlling or demanding, it may have influenced how they viewed Nolan after the crime, potentially re-evaluating their past interactions with him. 4. Family members and relatives' testimonies. Insight into parent-child tension. Family members who were close to the Buchanans had a deeper understanding of the friction between Nolan and his father. Some relatives might have witnessed firsthand the pressures Adam placed on Nolan or the struggles Nolan faced in meeting his father's expectations. The presence of a strained father-son dynamic would have been noticeable to close family, possibly with instances of heated arguments or visible frustration on Nolan's part, signaling unresolved resentment. Molly's perspective and concerns. As Nolan's stepmother, Molly likely had unique insights into the household tensions and may have confided in her relatives about her concerns. Molly's diary, which reportedly documented instances of abuse and conflict with Adam, serves as an essential source of context as it reflects the emotional turmoil within the family. Molly's worries about Nolan and her descriptions of Adam's behavior would have been particularly impactful, painting a picture of a household in distress. Extended family's retrospective reflection. After the crime, family members may have revisited past interactions, questioning if there were signs they missed. Relatives could have recalled Nolan's demeanor at family gatherings, perhaps noting signs of anger, withdrawal, or tension. These reflections, although in hindsight, would have provided a broader view of the family's internal struggles, highlighting aspects of Nolan's behavior that went unaddressed or unrecognized. 5. Friends of the family and acquaintances. Insights from family friends, while not as close as immediate family, often witness dynamics that family members may overlook. Friends of Adam and Molly might have seen tension or discord within the family and noted instances where Nolan seemed uncomfortable or frustrated. If these friends noticed signs of stress in Nolan, they might have attributed it to teenage angst, not realizing the deeper issues at play. Comparisons to other families. Nolan may have interacted with friends' families and observed different family dynamics, potentially making him more aware of the tension in his own home. This comparison could have fostered resentment toward his family, especially if he saw other families as more supportive or understanding. These comparisons might have fueled Nolan's desire for a different family structure, amplifying his frustration and feelings of isolation. Key insights from witness and family perspectives. Reinforcing the duality in Nolan's personality. The accounts from those around Nolan illustrate a dual nature: outwardly polite, disciplined, and sociable, but potentially inwardly troubled, isolated, and harboring resentment. His ability to maintain a positive public image likely reflects his desire to hide family issues and control how others viewed him. This duality underscores how Nolan could appear as an exemplary student while internally struggling with intense personal conflicts. Impact of concealed family tensions. Family members, particularly those close to Nolan, might have seen signs of the tension between him and his father, though they might not have realized the extent. These hidden conflicts created a pressure cooker environment where Nolan's frustrations festered, unacknowledged and unaddressed. His family's lack of insight into his emotional state may have contributed to his feeling that drastic measures were the only escape. Undetected resentment and mental isolation. Nolan's refusal to open up about family issues, combined with a lack of observable support from friends, suggests he felt mentally isolated. This isolation likely fueled his resentment and made him increasingly withdrawn, setting the stage for the tragic outcome. The inability or unwillingness of those around him to see the signs points to how easily severe personal struggles can go unnoticed in someone who maintains a controlled exterior. Through the reflections and testimonies of those who knew him, Nolan's character appears as a complex mixture of public compliance and private turmoil, hiding his true feelings until they culminated in a drastic and irreversible act. These insights from family, friends, and community members provide a fuller understanding of the pressures Nolan felt and the isolation that ultimately pushed him to a tragic conclusion. Psychological evolution of Nolan during the trial. In-depth analysis of his reactions, defense strategy, and courtroom behavior. Nolan Buchanan's psychological state throughout his trial sheds light on his perception of guilt, awareness of consequences, and possible mental defenses. Examining his courtroom demeanor, his personal defense, and the strategies employed by his lawyer offers insight into how he internalized and rationalized the crime, as well as his overall emotional response to the proceedings. 1. Nolan's courtroom reactions and behavior. Controlled demeanor and lack of visible remorse. Witnesses and observers noted that Nolan maintained a composed and almost detached demeanor in court, with limited visible displays of remorse or emotional reaction. This restraint might suggest an attempt to project innocence or indifference, possibly believing that a calm demeanor would portray him as rational and misunderstood rather than guilty. However, his lack of emotional expression could also indicate a deep-seated psychological detachment, potentially arising from repression or internalized guilt. Signs of psychological detachment. Nolan's apparent emotional detachment in court may have been a coping mechanism to distance himself from the reality of his actions. For individuals facing intense psychological stress or guilt, detachment can serve as a defense mechanism to avoid confronting the gravity of the situation. This lack of remorse may have been interpreted by the court as callousness, potentially undermining his defense by portraying him as emotionally unaffected by the loss of his family. Inconsistencies and shifts in his story. Throughout the trial, Nolan's version of events changed multiple times, reflecting a struggle to maintain a consistent narrative. His initial insistence on innocence, followed by a claim of self-defense, indicates a mental conflict between admitting some degree of guilt and attempting to justify his actions. This fluctuation might suggest an inability to fully process the consequences of his actions, or a deliberate attempt to test which version of events would elicit the most favorable response from the court. 2. Nolan's defense and justifications in court. Claim of self-defense against alleged abuse. Nolan eventually argued that his actions were an act of self-defense, painting his father as the aggressor and suggesting he acted out of fear. He portrayed his father as abusive, claiming that he had intervened to protect himself and his younger brother from a violent environment. This defense strategy likely stemmed from both a personal need to justify his actions and a legal tactic aimed at eliciting sympathy. By framing his actions as defensive rather than aggressive, Nolan may have been attempting to rationalize the crime, distancing himself from premeditated murder and shifting blame to his father's alleged behavior. Minimizing his role in the crime, Nolan's narrative in court focused on presenting himself as a victim, downplaying his agency in the murders. He suggested that he acted impulsively in response to provocation rather than out of premeditated malice. This minimization reflects a psychological distancing technique, as acknowledging full responsibility could have been overwhelming. Nolan's attempt to reduce his role suggests an underlying inability or unwillingness to fully confront the gravity of his actions. Defense's emphasis on psychological and emotional factors. The defense team highlighted Nolan's difficult home life, alleging that prolonged exposure to an abusive environment had impacted his mental health. This argument likely aimed to establish a basis for diminished capacity, suggesting that his mental state at the time of the crime was impaired due to prolonged psychological trauma. The defense may have believed that portraying Nolan as emotionally disturbed would garner sympathy from the jury, encouraging them to view him as a product of his environment rather than a remorseless killer. 3. Defense attorney strategy and arguments. Focusing on Nolan's age and vulnerability. The defense consistently emphasized Nolan's age, arguing that as a 16-year-old, he was vulnerable, impressionable, and potentially overwhelmed by the pressures of inheriting a failing business and dealing with family conflict. By positioning him as a young, vulnerable individual, the defense aimed to sway the jury toward empathy, framing him as someone who acted out of desperation rather than calculated malice. This argument was designed to mitigate Nolan's culpability by highlighting his psychological immaturity and lack of life experience. Leveraging evidence of alleged abuse. The defense strategically used evidence from Molly's diary, which documented instances of Adam's abusive behavior, to support Nolan's claims of self-defense. This evidence provided a tangible context for the abusive household Nolan described, lending some credibility to his justification for the murders. The defense likely argued that this environment contributed to Nolan's sense of entrapment, possibly inducing a fight-or-flight response that resulted in violence. This approach was intended to reframe the narrative, making the murders appear as a tragic result of prolonged abuse rather than an unprovoked act. Highlighting psychological impact and trauma. The defense team likely employed psychological experts to testify to Nolan's mental state, emphasizing the long-term effects of growing up in an abusive household. They argued that the emotional and psychological strain of living with his father may have impaired his judgment, leading to an impulsive, desperate act. By painting a picture of psychological trauma, the defense sought to invoke the jury's compassion, encouraging them to consider Nolan's mental health as a mitigating factor that reduced his criminal responsibility. 4. Prosecution's counterarguments and cross-examination. Challenging inconsistencies in Nolan's statements, the prosecution seized on Nolan's changing story, exposing inconsistencies to undermine his credibility. They argued that his fluctuating account suggested deception, as he adjusted his story to align with available evidence rather than presenting a truthful, consistent narrative from the beginning. This line of questioning highlighted Nolan's apparent manipulative tendencies, suggesting that he was attempting to manipulate the court's perception of his guilt. Highlighting premeditation evidence. The prosecution presented evidence that pointed to premeditation, including Nolan's handling of his father's credit card and his calculated disposal of evidence. They argued that these actions indicated a deliberate effort to cover up the crime, conflicting with his claim of acting in self-defense. This evidence reinforced the notion that Nolan's actions were planned rather than impulsive, countering the defense's narrative of psychological distress and trauma-induced behavior. Emphasizing lack of remorse, the prosecution also drew attention to Nolan's lack of visible remorse, arguing that his detachment and calm demeanor suggested a lack of empathy for his family. By emphasizing his emotional distance, the prosecution aimed to portray Nolan as cold and calculated, undermining the defense's argument that he was traumatized or acting out of desperation. The absence of remorse was presented as evidence of his capacity to commit murder with a clear and untroubled conscience. 5. Psychological impact of the trial on Nolan. Struggling with cognitive dissonance. Throughout the trial, Nolan likely experienced cognitive dissonance, a psychological phenomenon that arises when one's actions conflict with their self-perception. To cope, he may have constructed justifications for his actions, convincing himself that he acted in self-defense to reduce feelings of guilt. This internal conflict would explain the evolution of his narrative, as he sought a story that aligned with both his self-image and the reality of his actions. Emotional suppression as a defense mechanism. Nolan's seemingly cold demeanor may indicate that he was suppressing his emotions as a psychological defense. By distancing himself from his feelings, he could avoid fully acknowledging the consequences of his actions. This suppression could also have been a tactic to maintain composure in court, believing that emotional detachment would lend him credibility as a calm, rational individual. Development of a detached and rationalizing persona. Over the course of the trial, Nolan's behavior suggests he was constructing a version of himself that he believed would appeal to the court. This persona emphasized calm, rational thinking, possibly as a way to deny his emotional motivations. By presenting himself as someone who acted logically under distress, he might have sought to control how others perceived him, though this tactic backfired when his lack of visible remorse was interpreted as callousness. Conclusion. The complex psychological profile of Nolan Buchanan. Nolan's psychological state throughout the trial reveals a deeply conflicted individual grappling with guilt, self-justification, and a desire for control over his narrative. His defense relied heavily on portraying him as a traumatized, vulnerable young man influenced by abuse, while his own reactions, calm demeanor, inconsistent stories, and lack of remorse suggest a complex mix of denial, rationalization, and emotional suppression. This combination of psychological factors and courtroom behavior paints a picture of a young man who may have felt cornered, unable to fully confront the consequences of his actions. His demeanor and defense strategy reflect an individual struggling to reconcile a deep internal conflict, ultimately leading to a conviction that saw through his carefully constructed facade. Long-term impact of the Buchanan case on the community. In-depth analysis of community reaction and effects on family and neighbors. High-profile cases like the Buchanan family murders leave an enduring impact on the community, especially when involving complex dynamics and shocking details. In this analysis, we explore the various ways the tragedy affected the Buchanan family's community, examining the initial reactions, shifts in perception, and lasting emotional and psychological effects on both family members and neighbors. 1. Shock and initial reactions in the community. Immediate sensation and media attention. The gruesome nature of the Buchanan case, coupled with the involvement of a teenager, created a media sensation. Local residents were bombarded with news coverage, turning the once quiet Buchanan family into a focal point of intrigue and horror. This sensationalism intensified the community's sense of shock, making it difficult for residents to reconcile the heinous act with the seemingly normal family they thought they knew. Disbelief and confusion. Community members who interacted with Nolan or the Buchanan family expressed disbelief upon hearing the details. Many struggled to comprehend how someone like Nolan, whom they viewed as polite and successful, could be implicated in such a tragedy. This confusion created a sense of unease as people questioned their ability to truly know those around them. Friends, classmates, and neighbors reevaluated their past interactions with Nolan, seeking missed signs that might have hinted at his violent potential. Heightened sense of vulnerability. The nature of the crime committed within the family and involving premeditated violence shook the community's sense of safety. Family and domestic stability, often taken for granted, was suddenly called into question. People became more cautious, realizing that dark secrets and hidden tensions could exist even in the families they knew well. This event underscored a disturbing possibility that anyone, regardless of outward appearance, could harbor hidden turmoil or destructive intentions. 2. Shift in perception of the Buchanan family. Changing perception of Nolan. As details emerged about Nolan's involvement, the community's view of him shifted dramatically. Friends and neighbors, who once regarded him as a kind, ambitious young man, found it challenging to reconcile this image with that of a convicted murderer. Nolan's carefully crafted public persona unraveled, leaving many feeling betrayed and questioning their judgment. This shift in perception reinforced an atmosphere of mistrust, with people more wary of hidden emotions or troubled family dynamics. Reassessment of Adam Buchanan's role. The portrayal of Adam as a potential abuser who might have contributed to Nolan's emotional distress led some in the community to sympathize with Nolan's plight, albeit to a limited extent. Those who knew Adam were compelled to reevaluate their understanding of him, considering the possibility that he might have concealed harmful behaviors. This complex portrayal created a divided response. While some maintained their positive perception of Adam, others saw him as partially culpable, adding layers to the community's understanding of the tragedy. Stigmatization of the Buchanan name. The family name became stigmatized in the aftermath of the case, casting a shadow over any remaining family members or friends. This stigma likely extended to former employees of Buchanan Construction, who faced questions and awkward conversations about their association with the Buchanans. The association of the family with such a traumatic event created an emotional and social burden, as those connected to the Buchanans were left to process their loss while dealing with public scrutiny. 3. Psychological and emotional impact on neighbors and friends. Increased distrust and heightened vigilance. For neighbors and friends, the crime led to a sense of distrust in their own judgments and the people around them. They became more vigilant, looking for signs of domestic trouble or hidden issues in their own communities. In some cases, this heightened awareness may have led to excessive caution, with residents more likely to report suspicious behavior or distance themselves from people they deemed troubled. Emotional burden and survivor's guilt. Close friends or family members who had interactions with Nolan and the Buchanans may have felt a sense of survivor's guilt, wondering if they could have prevented the tragedy by recognizing signs earlier. This burden, though irrational, is common in cases of close-knit communities affected by trauma. Friends and family might have grappled with questions of what they could have done, creating an ongoing sense of unease and regret. Long-lasting trauma and anxiety. Many community members, particularly those close to the Buchanans, likely experienced long-term trauma from the case. Witnessing or hearing about such a disturbing crime within one's social circle can lead to anxiety, even in unrelated aspects of life. The sense of betrayal, coupled with the harrowing details of the crime, made it difficult for people to move on emotionally, resulting in heightened stress levels and potentially impacting their overall well-being. 4. Impact on younger community members. Influence on Nolan's classmates and peers. For Nolan's classmates, the case shattered the image of high school as a safe, predictable environment. Watching a peer become involved in a murder trial exposed them to the harsh realities of crime and mental health struggles at an early age. This exposure may have led to heightened anxiety among students, with some questioning their friendships and reassessing their understanding of personal relationships. Discussion and awareness of mental health. The case sparked conversations about the importance of mental health support and recognizing signs of distress, especially in young people. School counselors and community leaders may have taken steps to raise awareness, encouraging students and families to seek help for those experiencing stress, abuse, or other emotional challenges. This shift in focus highlighted the importance of addressing mental health proactively and may have led to increased mental health resources within the community. Impact on youthful idealism and trust. The involvement of someone close to their age in such a tragic event may have caused Nolan's peers to lose some of their youthful idealism, experiencing a jarring reminder of life's darker aspects. This loss of innocence left many feeling disillusioned as they struggled to reconcile the image of a friend or classmate with that of a convicted murderer. This emotional impact might have contributed to a cautious approach to forming friendships and trusting others. 5. Broader community awareness and response to domestic issues. Increased scrutiny of domestic relationships. The case likely raised awareness within the community about the signs of domestic abuse and the importance of addressing family conflict before it escalates. Social service organizations, churches, and local leaders may have stepped up efforts to educate residents on identifying and addressing potential abuse. This emphasis on proactive intervention reflects the community's desire to prevent similar tragedies in the future. Development of community support systems. In response to the tragedy, the community may have developed stronger support systems to help those facing family crises, including increased access to counseling, social services, and educational programs. The local government might have allocated resources toward family counseling centers, support groups, or workshops on conflict resolution, reflecting a collective commitment to address issues that might lead to similar situations. Encouragement of open communication and transparency. The Buchanan case served as a cautionary tale, emphasizing the dangers of hidden conflicts within families. Community leaders and organizations likely encouraged open communication, advocating for transparency and honesty as a means of reducing the likelihood of similar tragedies. This shift aimed to create an environment where individuals feel comfortable discussing family issues openly rather than letting tensions build privately. Conclusion: lasting impact on the community. The Buchanan family tragedy left a profound and enduring impact on their community. People's reactions evolved from shock and disbelief to mistrust and vigilance, with a renewed focus on the importance of mental health and domestic stability. Friends, family, and neighbors struggled with their personal emotions, while the community as a whole took steps to strengthen its support systems and raise awareness about the dangers of unresolved domestic conflict. The case serves as a somber reminder of the hidden complexities within families and the importance of addressing mental health proactively, shaping the community's approach to relationship safety and support for years to come. If you'd like, we can examine more specific community initiatives or explore the psychological effects on a particular group.